and welcome to Dateline London, the programme bringing together BBC expertise with correspondents filing around the world. I'm Geetha Garamuthi. This week we heard President Biden's new take on US foreign policy, ending support for the Saudi offensive in Yemen, a tougher line on Russia and a still strong stance against China. The challenges ahead are many. In the last few days alone, we've seen protests crushed and heard deeply unsettling evidence of the human capacity for evil. In China, horrifying news emerged of atrocities against the Muslim Uyghurs. In Russia, thousands were arrested for protesting in support of Alexei Navalny. And in Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi and civilian leaders have been put into detention in a military coup. But there is a new leader in the White House, which for many is grounds for hope. And across the world, we see almost unbelievable acts of individual bravery from those who will not be cowed. With me this week are the China expert, Isabel Hilton, the commissioning editor of the Mail on Sunday, Ian Birrell, and here in the studio to save social distance, of course, Lise Doucette, the BBC's chief international correspondent. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start, Isabel, with you, if I may, and I just want to ask you for your take briefly on the Joe Biden speech. Is it a big reset? He was still predictably still tough on China.
Well, some things won't change, and he doesn't have much wiggle room on China. This was a bipartisan area of concern before Trump, and that remains. And I don't think, given Xi Jinping's new authoritarianism, which has been building since he came to power in 2012, I think it's very difficult for any American leader, given the challenge that China is offering. He couldn't get away with it in Congress, for one thing, even if he wanted to. It's something that they're just going to have to square up to. But his difficulty, part of his difficulty will be reestablishing America's credibility as an ally after 4 years of Trump. And given that China works a lot through trade and investment, and how complicated trade deals are for a Democratic president, and given Biden's narrow wiggle room in Congress, I think that's going to be a little bit complicated. And then there are the big questions and where they fit in. John Kerry has said that he wants to carve out climate change. It remains to be seen whether China will allow climate change to be separated from other issues, other contentious issues.
Ian Birrell, what was your one sort of big takeaway from the Biden speech?
Well, I thought it was interesting to see the approach to Russia, which has always been a problem for American presidents. And it was more a resetting again of policy back towards the pre-Trump era, with a firm line on things like the Navalny issue and on human rights abuse and what America would see as wrongful behavior. But equally a hand being offered to try and restart process on things like missile controls with the New START treaty. So in a way, it was a reassertion of the more traditional American stance, which I suspect is what we're going to see with so much of the Biden presidency.
And Lise, a lot of Asia-Pacific focus, but of course the Middle East always a key strategic part of the world for the US. What did you take from it?
I was very interested in what they decided to focus on in detail, the most detail, in his first foreign policy speech at the State Department. He didn't choose the Iran nuclear deal, huge policy priority.
Didn't mention Iran.
Because his Congress is divided and his own administration doesn't know really what to do. He didn't talk about Afghanistan, which again, his administration doesn't know what to do. He chose Yemen. There have been months of bipartisan support resolutions in the Congress calling on the United States to end military support to the Saudi-led coalition, to end the war. President Trump ignored them largely. And so President Biden has picked up the baton to say, in his words, I want to end the war, ending all US support for offensive operations, engaging diplomatically. And it probably was the one issue where he was welcomed across the board. It will be hard to end the big war, which is against the Saudi-led coalition backed by the West, backing the Yemen government, against the Houthis aligned to Iran. But 6 years after the war started, there are so many small wars that have to be ended. Big job, but he's taking the first step.
And that's a very sort of big, global, quick look across many parts of the world. But I want to pick up one theme this week, which has really struck me, and it's been the incredible bravery of individuals that we've seen standing up for justice in whatever they believe in, whether China, Russia or Myanmar. In China, the BBC reported utterly horrifying accounts of atrocities against Muslim Uyghur women. The story coming to light because of one woman daring to speak out. Isabel, it was very difficult to read, let alone imagine what people have been going through. Why, in your view, is China so resolute in this action?
It's a totalizing policy. I mean, we are effectively seeing an attempt to eradicate the separate identity of a people who are a Turkic people with a different language, a different culture, a different history from China. They're not, in any sense culturally Chinese, and this territory was only conquered by military conquest in the late 19th century. In the 20th century, several moves to re-establish independence and ambivalent approach by the party. The party had very much a Soviet approach to minorities within its borders for a long time, which was to give them notional autonomy. That could have worked. But we're in a different China now. We're in a China that is trying to claim, 5,000 years of unchanging history. China is eternal, immutable. And these people, with their notable differences, are a problem. So we have seen since 2012 effectively a cultural genocide going on in Xinjiang. And as Lise well knows, when you have policies like that, women become a major victim.
And Lise, just let me bring you in, because the BBC's obviously had some criticism from China in reporting this story.
A lot of criticism from China reporting this story, reporting how they've responded to the COVID-19 crisis. But that's journalism, asking questions and trying to get answers. And it's interesting that the latest is that Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has called his Chinese counterpart to say that we've got to do something about this. And that was very much in President Biden's speech as well, where the voices are silent have been from the Muslim world. The OIC in 2019 came up with a statement saying that the Organization of Islamic States saying that commending China for taking care of its Muslim population. The only really Muslim majority country which has spoken out and criticized has been Turkey. But now there are some reports that China is the biggest supplier of vaccines to Turkey. And while China says, no, we won't put vaccines and foreign policy together, there's some concern that Turkey too could fall silent. And that's why, as Isabel knows, the whole Uyghur crisis shows you the rising ascendancy of China with its one of the biggest investment projects in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. Countries don't want to criticize China for fear of repercussions.
And Ian Birrell, I know you followed the whole origins of the COVID and the COVID investigation very closely with China, but when you read that this account on the way some Uyghur women have been treated and attacked, what were your thoughts?
Well, to be honest, it was great. It was a very strong story by the BBC. I went to Sweden and spoke to a Kazakh woman who was also in the camps and saw these sorts of sexual abuses and atrocities taking place. And I've also been to Turkey and spoken to many women there who have suffered things like forced sterilization and forced abortions, even at 9 months of pregnancy. And so I think it's striking how grim the details are. And also we know now a lot of what's going on. Xi has ramped up the oppression. He's made life utterly intolerable as he tries to wipe out separate peoples. And really, it's just such a clear issue of genocide taking place, which people have to be strong against and have to stand up against, even if that results, I think, in economic damage to their own countries.
And Lise, in terms of why the Middle East countries are not getting more involved and haven't got more involved in this question, apart from Chinese influence and power, is there any other reason? Because that's been a question many have raised.
Well, there is this, take for example Pakistan, which is a very close relations with China, decades of being very, very close partners, partly because of their problems with India. When the Prime Minister Imran Khan was first asked about it, he said, "Well, I don't know anything about this." And when he was asked again by another journalist, he said, "Well, my aides haven't briefed me on it." And then when he was asked again at the World Economic Forum, he says, "Well, China helped us out when we were down, so we're going to help them." Saudi Arabia, which is the custodian of the two holiest shrines in Islam, they've not spoken out. In a sense, they agree with the Chinese view that these are internal matters and we should not be criticizing. But as I mentioned earlier, they're also concerned about China's growing sway in the world. But also China argues that the Uyghurs are terrorists. We're fighting against terrorists. And so in some ways, they accept that argument. And in so many of these countries, whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, there are large Uyghur populations. And in fact, very secretly, a lot of countries have sent Uyghurs back. And now there's a concern that the large Uyghur community in Turkey could also be sent back. There's a discussion of an extradition bill. So it is still unfolding, as we speak.
As we speak. Lise, thanks very much. Well, let's move to Russia now, where a man who nearly died after being poisoned didn't give up and go away. He fought back. This week, Alexander Navalny made a heart sign to his wife, Yulia, in the courtroom in Moscow as he was sentenced to nearly 3 years in jail. Ian Birrell, it's extraordinary. One can't imagine what Navalny is made of to return to this fight. What did you make of those events? It was very moving watching the courtroom images, I thought.
No, his bravery is extraordinary. To have suffered that poisoning, to have suffered previous attempts on his life, to then issue that extraordinary documentary showing what they allege to be Putin's palace, a £1 billion edifice on the Black Sea with astonishing security and just a fictionalized portrait of wealth. And then to return and lay down such a challenge is extraordinary. On a human level, the bravery is incredible. But it also puts Putin in a very difficult position, because does he martyr this person or does he leave him be? And he knows that there is support within the country. It's what's really interesting, I think, about the protests that have exploded is the difference between now and the previous protests. I was there in 2011 for the last lot of protests, and people talked very energetically about confronting the state and defending democracy. But at the same time, there was a realism that these were people who'd grown up in the Soviet era. They were tasting the fruits of economic growth. They were traveling the world, and they didn't really want to give that up and risk everything to take on the state. This feels slightly different. It's younger people. We see from the polls, such as they are, that there's a disenchantment among younger people with the Putin regime. They've only known this kind of country, this kind of leadership in their lives. And also 1 in 7 people in Russia are beneath the poverty line. So to see those images of the palace and to see the behavior of the oligarchs when so many people are struggling with basic living conditions and basic standards of living is something very strong, I think. I don't think we're on the cusp of seeing Putin thrown out right now, but at the same time, this does feel different, and this does feel something that Navalny has put his finger on and sparked with his constant campaign to expose what they call the party of thieves in charge.
Isabel Hilton, it's striking that Putin still has such popularity, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Although, I do remember the scenes of weeping when the last dictator of North Korea died, or indeed Mao Zedong. So, one can't really account for that kind of popularity as you would in a democratic system where people are free to form and express their own opinions. But I think that Ian has kind of put his finger on the question of the dilemma for Putin, because if you lock up morally credible people as a dictator, you tend to enlarge their reputation. Think Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Navalny is a classic case of this. And the underlying problems which have fed today's discontent are set to continue. Russia's economic model is exhausted. 50% of its oil goes to China. China's oil demand is set to peak in 2025, just 4 years away, and then decline. Putin needs high oil prices and a continuing demand for fossil fuels, and he's not going to get it. So he's in a dilemma. He's locked up a morally credible figure, and he can't fix the problems that are fueling discontent.
Lise, locking up Navalny, will it help or hinder Putin?
Well, initially, the big question was that the first round of protests, that not only were they bigger in number, they were in places where there'd never been protests before, right across all the many time zones of Russia. And the question was, well, will there be momentum? How long will they continue? Will they peter out? Will Navalny, when he's detained and now, of course, now in prison, still be a rallying cry? What we've been hearing in the last day from protesters is that they're hearing from the Navalny team, and I'm not sure whether Ian is here or different, that they've decided to pull back from the street protests, partly because of the brutality of the Russian police, but also because they want to save their fire for the upcoming parliamentary elections at the end of the year. So that's what they're going to focus on, seeing that as their better opportunity to make not just their voices known, but to actually get real power, if you like. And what's really been remarkable in this is how organized the Navalny team was. They were all prepared when he came back. The list of people who should be sanctioned was put out. The instructions were given about how to organize the protest. They thought this through. This is not just a spontaneous, impromptu act.
Ian, I don't know what you're hearing about in terms of whether the protests are going to delay their fire. And again, it was just incredible watching people being dragged off the streets this week, young people not willing to give up.
No, it is. It's in many ways quite inspiring when you see people fighting for freedom in places like this, in Belarus, where I was last year, when we're quite casual in the West about our own democracies. But it was also fascinating to see that even in Yakutsk in the first week, when the temperatures were below 50 degrees, people came out in the streets. And equally, there have been thousands of arrests, record number of arrests the first week, about 4,000, and then more the second week. And also I saw a figure of about 82 journalists being rounded up. And these things will trickle through a little bit. I suspect there will be a pulling back now. But, this is an issue which is bubbling away very dangerously for the regime.
And Isabel, when we look at that Joe Biden speech, I mean, obviously a very different take on Russia compared with his predecessor is what everyone is imagining. How is that going to change the outlook for Russia and China? Obviously still much to be seen on that front.
Again, that's I think comes back to the question of who's credible and what people aspire to. And, again, before Trump or in the long period of the Cold War, protesting crowds on the street tended to look to Western democracies. Now, that's taken a bit of a hammering lately, but if Biden can restore the idea that there is a kind of moral core at the heart of his government, then I think it will give courage back to people on the streets. They won't feel alone in the face of dictatorships.
Isabel Hilton, thanks very much indeed. Well, to another figure of global renown, Aung San Suu Kyi, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for her enduring fight for democracy in Myanmar. Her allure was tarnished when she failed to condemn the military actions against the Muslim Rohingyas. Well, now the generals who drove that brutal assault are fully in charge of Myanmar. So, Lise, is this the end for the lady?
Well, the lady, as you say, has a very different reputation now. During her many years of house arrest, she was, of course, hailed by the world as a pro-democracy leader, Nobel Prize laureate. People flocked to her door when her house arrest was lifted, when martial law ended. So it was interesting, the reactions to the coup. Human rights organizations said, well, let's put aside our concerns about where Aung San Suu Kyi stands when it comes to human rights for all the people of Myanmar. We condemn the coup. Now, judging by the last elections, where they swept the elections, a landslide, she still has a lot of popularity, and some would argue even more popularity now. The NLD is still the National League for Democracy is still very popular, and that explains a lot of why this has happened with the military. So the world will still be concerned about her. In fact, we don't know where she is. There's been no confirmed information about her whereabouts. She is the recognized leader of people supporting at least a return to some kind of democracy in Myanmar.
Ian Burrell, I mean, people are asking, how physically safe is Aung San Suu Kyi going to be now? How politically safe? Does she have a future?
I think she certainly has a future, but in many ways what I find fascinating is that here is a country which crushed democracy in the year that I was born, 1962. Then it's had this brief flirtation over the last decade of slightly loosening the ties. And yet at the core of everything is a dilemma which was identified by Winston Churchill. And it's the same dilemma that Putin has. It's the same dilemma that Museveni has, for instance, or Kagame in Rwanda and Uganda, which is, what does a dictator do? How do they get out? It's the Churchill called it, it's like riding a tiger, that you can't get off the back, because if you do, the system you've created devours you. And that's particularly true in a place like Myanmar or a place like Russia, where there's incredible corruption and people have stolen vast sums of money. It's seen from what we know about the Myanmar coup that really it was all about protecting the income for a very small group around the generals, and it was all about protecting their assets, and that was why they so fear democracy. And this is the age-old dilemma, and the problem, I think, for the West is when we end up propping up some of these regimes, which we have done in parts of the world, and we fall for the myth of the sort of strong person in charge, that actually we're creating these systems which are explosive and they're very hard, and when they do erupt, when you try to take the person off the back of the tiger, they can have cataclysmic explosions in trying to sort the problems and return to democracy, or find a way or path to more freedom and looser control and more space for civil society.
Isabel, do you think Aung San Suu Kyi is safe? Does she have a political future?
I think she's physically safe. I think they're well aware of the dangers of any physical harm coming to her. My take on the policy is that, you know, dictatorships need some kind of legitimation. And we've seen 20 years of attempting to legitimize through referenda, through elections, through a rigged constitution, what is the raw power of the military. They have attacked her landslide victory in November. If this sounds familiar from other countries, stop me, on the grounds of fraud. They wanted to postpone the parliament to investigate that fraud, and the coup is the result of not getting that done. So I think what they'll do with Aung San Suu Kyi is that they will convict her on these minor criminal charges, which will disqualify her from standing in another election. They will then stage some even more controlled elections, which will sanctify their power. And we'll see. She's a very powerful totemic figure. Will this work? It hasn't worked in the past. So the game goes on, I think.
And Isabel, I mean, in terms of the role of China, which is utterly crucial, is it clear that they are definitely fully backing the military generals in this? Have they lent some support to Aung San Suu Kyi in that movement too?
They have got on surprisingly well with Aung San Suu Kyi in the past. I think there were greater expectations that she would be more hostile to China, but she's played a very canny game with China. They have no complaint against Aung San Suu Kyi, so they have just said, you know, hands off. You know, we don't interfere in the internal affairs of another country. They have massive investments in Myanmar. They have oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and infrastructure, access to the Bay of Bengal. So they're really trying to straddle both sides here.
And Lee's other neighbouring countries, big powerhouses like India, you know, Pakistan, which is the Chinese ally, they're all going to be affected by this further destabilisation. But again, the question, partly for many, comes back to the Rohingya. Are the Muslim states supporting the Rohingya people now stranded tragically in Bangladesh in camps? You know, how is this whole the military manoeuvres going to affect the power balance?
You know, everything we've talked about today in Dateline is it really touches on what I think is really the defining moment in the world in which we are. The proliferation of platforms on social media has given everyone a megaphone, including world leaders. So the words that leaders have to condemn policies and actions that they don't like, whether it's from Washington or Beijing or Moscow, are even greater. The words are so fine and there's so many of them. But the tools to do anything more are very limited, because we've seen that sanctions actually don't have much impact, in fact, no impact, whether in Russia or as Iran, changing behavior of people. So what can, for example, the Biden administration do when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Myanmar? We know Anthony Blinken called his Chinese counterpart, and said, could you please be tougher on the generals in Myanmar? But we are back to that old mantra. When it comes to foreign policy, interests come before values. And I think a lot of people are asking now, when the new Biden team makes common cause with Europe on issues like human rights, will Vladimir Putin listen? Will the Chinese leader listen? Who will listen and who will act? Or are we just going to have a lot more words and no action?
OK, that question back to you, Ian and Isabel. We've got 2 minutes at the end of the programme. What hope for change, perhaps driven from the US, on these huge questions?
Well, I think at least we're seeing a reassertion of America as trying to be what it's always aspired and not always lived up to, which is some kind of moral beacon in the world for a sort of freer way of life. But in a way, what's so interesting about all these issues is that there's long been this debate about the importance of individuals in history, whether individuals change history or whether they're just part of waves and surges within societies. And of course, what we've seen so much is a few handful of individuals here. We're talking about Xi in China, who's changed the nature of the Communist Party and the repression in China, Putin in Russia, Trump, of course, in America. In all these places, Navalny, of course, challenging them. In all these places, it's fascinating to see how individuals are trying to flex their muscles, exert their power, and as Lee says, are strengthened in some ways by social media. And it's an amazing reflection on that age-old debate within history.
Isabel.
The old Marx says, right, men do not make their own history. But so I have to mention this. We are speaking 10 years on from the Arab Spring, so-called, that mesmerized the world. And those were revolutions right across the region in places where if you opened your mouth, you were thrown in jail. Those were leaderless revolutions. Now this, we're in 10 years on and these people are rising up again. This time they have leaders. And Ian, maybe you're right. Maybe individuals do make their own history. Let's see how this round of uprisings fares, and if it fares better than when people rose up. There was this great mantra during the Arab Spring: the power of the people is greater than the people in power.
Lise Doucette, Isabel Hilton, Ian Birrell, thank you all so much for your time today. We are out of time. So many big questions. It's been a really momentous week across the globe. Huge ripples, perhaps unsurprising also, as we see change coming out of Washington. We will be here next week. Sean Lay will be in the chair. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.